My name is Dr. Erin Baumgartner, and I'm an Associate Director at the Houston Education Research Consortium, or HERC, at Rice University. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. The topic of today's webinar is important and timely, particularly given the struggles that many students are facing as they're in their third year of not your typical school year. In particular, I'm talking about how we understand the skills that go beyond test scores, but thinking about the social and emotional developmental skills that provide students, and really all of us, the tools we need to be successful in our everyday lives. These skills range from being able to stick with a task until we're done, to how we build and maintain relationships, to how we communicate with others. As today's speakers and panelists will attest, we cannot think about how to support the student as a whole child without recognizing that social and emotional skills are one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. I'll begin by introducing Andreas Schleicher, who is the director for the Directorate of Education and Skills at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. While some people recognize the role the OECD plays in understanding economic circumstances around the world, a very important aspect of this is understanding variation in education around the world as well. Mr. Schleicher is responsible for creating PISA, the Program of International Student Assessment, a tool by which countries can understand where they stand in comparison to each other and use this information to drive reform in their education systems to best serve the needs of students. He's a former recipient of the prestigious McGraw Prize in Education, an author, and speaks often about and with a clear commitment to helping countries around the world work for educational change. He is here today to tell us about a worldwide study around social and emotional skills led by the OECD in the fall of 2019, for which the Houston Independent School District, or HISD, was the sole US representative. We would particularly like to thank Andreas for joining us from the future, as he is based in Paris, which is about 7 hours ahead, although I am not sure where you are joining us from today. So with that, Andreas, thank you.
Thanks so much for inviting at Congress is taking place, but it's a great pleasure, and I really want to congratulate you for joining this very first global survey on the social and emotional skills. We have a long history of measuring academic outcomes, both nationally and internationally. Our PISA study is just one example, but they are just part of the story of what makes individuals, businesses, countries really successful. And we actually do know that employers very much value social emotional skills. Now, I think education knows how to educate second-class robots. People are very good at repeating what we told them, but what will make us human at a time when the kind of things that are easy to teach and easy to test have become easy to digitize. And when you think about it, social emotional skills are very much at the center. We shouldn't call them soft skills. They may be the hard skills in the 21st century. And it's hard to measure. I admit that. This is the very first effort. But we also know that what doesn't get measured usually doesn't get looked at and doesn't get improved. So it is really important. So this is the first such survey. We focused on 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds, and we took probability samples of 3,000 students from each age cohort in each of the participating city, which gives us quite a robust statistical evidence base on this. The survey covers a quite wide range of measures, and we choose those which research shows are predictive for labor market success, but also social success. For example, open-mindedness. Think about, curiosity or creativity. We looked at task performance, including responsibility, self-control, persistence. We know how much those matter. We looked at sociability, assertiveness, collaboration, but also at aspects like stress resistance, how well people can manage their emotions, things that I think in this pandemic have been so fundamental for student success. And we know also that the development of cognitive, social, and emotional skills really starts very early on during infancy. For some of those social emotional skills, brain sensitivity is particularly high in the first years of life. And but what's also interesting, unlike academic skills, the development of social and emotional skills doesn't follow a kind of steady upward trends. There can be ups and downs, and public policy needs to be aware of this. For example, a very striking result from the survey is that 15-year-olds, and quite irrespective of their gender or social background, generally reported lower social emotional skills on average than their 10-year-old peers. Once again, psychologists have explanations for all of that, but we should be aware of this. Teachers should understand and know those in order to provide an environment to address it. We also saw, for example, that 15-year-olds report to be less creative than 10-year-olds. If I would tell you, 15-year-olds do worse in mathematics than 10-year-olds, you would probably tell me there must be something really wrong with schooling. But that's precisely what we see on an aspect like creativity. Now, once again, you can say 15-year-olds probably are more self-aware, maybe more self-critical. There are developmental aspects involved. But actually, when we ask parents and teachers, and we did that very systematically for all of the students, we got the same picture. So maybe, education takes something away from the creativity that people are all born with. Now, we should think about those kinds of questions. Everybody is born with an abundance of creativity. If you have a 3-year-old son or daughter, they're going to question everything you say to them. They're going to experiment with anything that gets into their way. And they are always willing to learn, always willing to unlearn, always willing to relearn when the context changes. And then, when they get to school, we try to make them compatible with our ways of thinking and working. And maybe that is, something that challenges the kind of creativity. Another important finding was that those social emotional skills really differ quite a bit by gender. Girls reported generally higher skills related to task performance, responsibility, achievement, motivation. They also did better on many of the social skills like empathy, cooperation, tolerance, but boys showed higher performance on emotional regulation skills, stress resistance, greater optimism, better emotional control, more assertiveness, energy. So again, in mathematics and science, education has done well to even out those differences because we always see them. But when it comes to social emotional skills, I'm not sure we are aware enough to actually address those differences. Similarly, social background plays a really important role. Now we can see that in virtually every city, students from more privileged backgrounds had higher social emotional skills. And that's not so hard to understand. That probably their parents were more aware of the importance of those skills, or they had better opportunities to develop them, or out of school kind of opportunities. And maybe, students from very disadvantaged backgrounds just have a really tough life and not being able to develop this. But again, we should be aware of this. If we can see those social differences, we can intervene, address them. And it's also quite interesting that they play out quite differently in different districts. That's why it's always important to look at this in an international comparative context. You can see some countries actually showing more pronounced differences and others actually even out more. We also see that those social emotional skills are actually quite important predictors of school grades. Some people see, cognitive and social emotional skills as sort of two ends on a wide spectrum. If you focus so much on social emotional skills, you're going to detract from academic outcomes. Actually, you look at the survey results, you find they're actually two sides of the same coin. Students doing better on this will actually also do better academically. And I also want to say that the survey just didn't only measure social emotional skills. We also looked at psychological well-being, something that I think we've all understood in this pandemic, how important that really is. And for example, we see that social emotional skills are actually quite closely linked to psychological well-being. And that's true even after, accounting for social background or gender. Being optimistic is consistently related to higher levels of life satisfaction, greater psychological well-being in every city. Now, stress resistance and being optimistic are also very much related to lower test anxiety. That was an interesting question for us. Some people say, well, test anxiety, we should get rid of the test. But you can see actually some of the cities with the toughest test, like Daegu in Korea. If you think, education in Houston is tough, send your child 1 week to Korea and actually going to come happy back for the rest of their lives. There are very big differences, but those students have learned to manage that. They show a high level of stress resistance, and that seems to be countering test anxiety. And now you ask yourself, what helps students to become more stress resistant, more optimistic? And this is where the survey really revealed some of the most interesting findings. The best predictor for stress resistance, optimism, curiosity, is the quality of student-teacher relationships. And what this really shows us that education is not a transactional business. It's a social, it's a relational enterprise where the quality of student-teacher relationship was strong. You could see this right across the whole spectrum, where students felt happier, they felt more optimistic, more stress resistant. It's the quality of student relationships. And we must say in our education systems often we have squeezed that out. We focus teachers very much on the subject matter of teaching. Particularly, I don't know about Houston, but in general about the United States, teachers have much less time for other things than teaching. And that can be a detractor. They cannot engage as much with the student's life, and you could see that's really, really important. Now, I have spoken long enough. All I want to really say is that it's so important for education to strive for really holistic development of their students. And that included a lot more than academic skills. It really recognizes the importance of social emotional skills for students' well-being, but also for their academic performance. Last remark, you may ask yourself, why do this in an international comparative study? Why not just study this in Houston? But actually, once you see the results, you will see the answer. These things play out very, very differently in different cities. And we can use the world as a great laboratory, see how those things play out differently in different contexts, and then learn from and with each other to develop the right policy to ensure that every student has that kind of environment that fosters the combination of cognitive, social, and emotional development. Thank you very much. And once again, congratulations for joining this effort.
Andreas, thank you for joining us today and telling us a little bit about kind of the overview of this study and some of the things we learned around the world as it relates to social and emotional skills. It's so important in helping us understand how Houston fits into that bigger picture. Now I'm going to invite Dr. Ruth Lopez Turley to join us and tell us a little bit more about some of the things that we've learned in Houston. Dr. Turley is a professor of sociology, the founder and director of the Houston Education Research Consortium, and an associate director and the future director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University. I'll let Dr. Turley tell you more about HERC in just a moment. A graduate of Stanford and Harvard, she's received numerous teaching and mentoring awards and has served in elected and appointed positions in the American Sociological Association, the American Educational Research Association, the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness, and the National Research Council of the National Academies. She is originally from Laredo, Texas, and her own educational trajectory has really impacted how she views and understands the importance of education and ensuring all students have equitable opportunities. And with that, I will introduce Dr. Turley to share a bit about what we've learned in Houston.
Thanks so much, Erin, and I appreciate that introduction. And thanks also to Andreas for joining us today. It was so wonderful to see you again. I had the privilege of meeting you in person a couple of times at the early stages of this international effort. So I want to begin by just saying a little bit about HERC before I dive into the Houston results of this study. So first of all, HERC, the Houston Education Research Consortium, is a research practice partnership between Rice University and 11 Houston area school districts representing over 700,000 students. HERC aims to connect education research with local decision-making for the purpose of ultimately improving educational equity. So as you can see, this study fits right in with that aim. HISD was our original partner since 2011. We have been in a formal partnership with that school district. It is the largest school district in the state of Texas and the 8th largest in the United States. Most relevant to this project, HISD's Social and Emotional Learning Department has been working very closely with us and in particular with Dr. Roberta Scott, who you'll hear from shortly. But we're very proud that this study aligns really well with HISD's vision for social and emotional learning, which is to coordinate the implementation and growth of culturally responsive and emotionally safe learning environments. Next slide. So several years ago, I was approached by the commissioner of the National Center for Education Research, my friend and colleague, Tom Brock, who was very interested in having Houston represent the US in this study for several reasons. Well, primarily because of the size of Houston, its demographics, which in many ways represent the future demographics of the United States, but also because of HERC, because of our existing partnership with the school district. They felt that Houston was a great location for a study such as this. So in fall of 2019, right before the pandemic, we administered the survey instrument that was developed by the OECD to 6,400 HISD students in 119 campuses. And for the purposes of this presentation, we're focusing on student-reported skills, but I should note that parents and teachers were also asked to provide information about student skills. And you can refer to our briefs and technical report for more detailed information about the administration of this study, but this gives you the general overview. So I'm just going to cover an overview of our findings thus far. And the first part of the study is focused on looking at the variation in skills among HISD students. And it should probably come as no surprise that there are some areas where students reported much higher skills, whereas there are other areas where students reported much lower levels of social and emotional skills. So students reported higher levels of skills, specifically in terms of tolerance, curiosity, creativity, cooperation, and self-efficacy. Now, for those skills, you see it says both in parentheses, it means we found high levels of skills among both age groups, the 10-year-olds as well as the 15-year-olds. But then we did find some age group differences. So we found that students reported higher levels of motivation among 10-year-olds and higher levels of empathy among 15-year-olds. In contrast to those areas, we found that students reported lower levels of stress resistance. This was true for both 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds. We found that 10-year-olds reported lower levels of assertiveness, and that 15-year-olds reported lower levels of trust. We also looked at how skills vary between students of different demographic characteristics, such as gender and economic status. But because the OECD reports focused on those skills, we want to share a few areas that are unique to the research that we have done here in Houston. So in Houston, we focused on some groups that aren't really included in the OECD report, but that are very important here in this context. In particular, we consider differences by race and ethnicity, as well as differences among students who are English learners versus those who are not English learners. And so we found that for Asian, Black, and white students, there are some common patterns among both 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds reporting higher levels of the skills listed here. But for Hispanic students, there was more variation between groups, with 10-year-olds reporting higher levels of emotion control and self-control, and 15-year-olds reporting higher levels of optimism. We also see that whites reported higher levels of creativity and empathy. So for students who are English learners or not quite proficient in English, overall, they reported lower levels of skills than their English proficient counterparts. However, there are a few areas where English learners do report higher skills than non-English learner students, particularly in terms of stress resistance, emotion control, self-control, and trust. In addition to understanding who has strengths in social and emotional skills and who might benefit from support in developing those skills, it's also important to the school district to understand whether and how these skills are connected with student outcomes. So the first outcome that we look at is student grades. In particular, we consider how students' self-reported social and emotional skills are connected to their grades in both math and reading in the fall of 2019. And we found overall, we see a similar pattern for both 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds related to persistence. So for both of these age groups, we found that self-reported persistence is associated with both math and reading scores, with students who report higher levels of persistence also earning higher course grades in both math and reading. And just as a quick note, the way persistence is defined, it's defined as the ability to continue and complete tasks and activities in spite of challenges and distractions. So persistence seems to matter quite a bit when it comes to math and reading scores. Next, in considering outcomes beyond academics, we first focus on the relationship between students' socio-emotional skills and attendance. As you know, attendance is very, very important. You have to be there in order to have an opportunity to learn. And for the purpose of this project, we hone in on a definition of high absence as an indicator of attendance, with students who missed more than 10% of school days having high absence. And we chose that definition because this is the cutoff for getting course credit. So while the previous findings considered the experiences of both 10-year-olds and 15-year-olds, this particular analysis focuses only on 15-year-olds because they were more likely than 10-year-olds to experience higher rates of absence. So we wanted to zoom in on absence and figure out how socio-emotional skills might be related to that. And this is what we find. We found that students who self-reported higher levels of assertiveness and self-control are more likely to experience higher rates of absenteeism, while students who reported higher levels of cooperation or emotion regulation were less likely to experience high rates of absenteeism. Next, I want to look at another very important outcome that goes beyond academics, but of course is also very important. In addition to absenteeism, we looked at student discipline. Now, when discussing discipline, we're focusing on the student's likelihood of experiencing some sort of an exclusionary discipline. This refers to discipline that might remove them from a traditional classroom setting, such as in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, or a referral to an alternative education program. Now, because discipline is most frequently experienced by students who are Black or Hispanic, very few whites or Asian American students in our sample experienced disciplinary action. So this analysis focuses exclusively on Blacks and Hispanics. And in addition, this analysis also focuses on 15-year-old students because school discipline is such a rare event for 10-year-old students, but it's more common among 15-year-olds, so we zoomed in on that age group. And this is what we find. We found that students who self-reported higher levels of assertiveness are also more likely to experience discipline, while students who reported higher levels of self-control or persistence were less likely to experience discipline. And again, this is just focusing on Blacks and Hispanics and 15-year-olds. So overall, what we learned through this study is, first of all, that social and emotional skills vary a lot and they do matter. So those are the two main take-home points. They vary a lot, and how they vary matters for the kinds of outcomes that we care about. In particular, we found that persistence is a strong predictor of receiving higher grades in both math and reading. We found that cooperation and emotion regulation is related to fewer attendance struggles. And we found that self-control and persistence are related to not experiencing discipline and suspension in particular. So what's next? We have several forthcoming briefs. In particular, we have one tentatively titled Understanding Student Context and Social and Emotional Skills, which will look at how the characteristics of students' familial, school, peer, and neighborhood contexts are associated with specific socio-emotional skills. And after that, we'll have another forthcoming brief, Examining Teacher Report of Student Social and Emotional Skills, which looks at the extent to which teacher reports of socio-emotional skills differ from student reports. So we have more work ahead in making sure that we get the most out of this huge data collection effort as possible. And we also plan to have a follow-up webinar in the spring of 2022. So please be sure to join us for that. Thank you very much. And now I'd be happy to entertain some questions.
Thanks, Ruth. And Andreas, if you are able to join us as well, that would be great. There have been a few questions that are popping into the chat that I thought might be, Andreas, you might have some insight into. One of the questions that we received was, what have you learned about measuring social and emotional skills connected to this study? As you noted in the beginning, this is something that has not happened very often, especially in the worldwide context. And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you learned about the process of collecting information on these skills, and what are some things you might be able to build on?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. One of the things that surprised us is that's actually easier than we thought. You know, when you read the literature, it is a very complex issue. And what we found that most of the scales that we used were at least metrically comparable. Some of them, you know, it's difficult to compare the averages, and we try to avoid that because students in different cultures might have different kind of levels of responses. But with that caveat, actually, we found that most of those scales are metrically comparable. We found that students and parents and teachers actually have very good response rates to this. This was another worry that we had, you know, that people might think this is very personal. I might not respond to this. So I do think this is all very, very encouraging. Where we would like to see this going in the future is to develop, at least for some areas, direct measures, and rather than indirect ones. And I think that there are some avenues that we are currently exploring. That's sort of the progression that we would see for the future.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add just briefly that I remember some of our early conversations were about measuring these types of skills for younger children as well. I know that was very much the desire of the folks at OECD. But that's a little bit harder, a little bit more expensive to do so, but the desire is still there that we can and should. I'm just posing this as a future study, right? That we should look at younger age groups, younger than 10-year-olds, because we know that these skills begin to develop at very early ages. And we also know that the sooner we can intervene, these skills are, of course, they're all teachable. They're not just, you're not just born with these skills or not born with these skills, they're teachable. And therefore, the earlier we can intervene, the better.
I very much agree with this. I would just like to say that actually we have meanwhile developed a survey of 5-year-olds. And actually, as you say, it's more expensive because there you need to also add external observers. The quality of measurement is actually better. Because you do not have issues around social desirability. You know, 5-year-olds are actually quite straightforward to tell you about them. For example, when we looked at empathy, we gave them a storybook and on a tablet with 2 characters and looked at and observed their responses and reactions to this. And actually, we can score those things quite quite well. So actually, I think the measurement is very well doable. You get better measures, but it is a much more resource-intensive process also because you cannot send external observers to those children. You have to basically train the staff of the, and that was the cost. But I agree with you. That's where the story becomes really interesting because many of those skills are learned best in those ages. No?
One of the follow-up questions that I have, and it's based on Ruth, something that you mentioned as the area, one of the areas HERC is going next. And Andreas, I think you mentioned this a bit when you were talking to. Do you have any idea at this point whether teacher feedback matches the information that students are self-reporting?
Yeah, actually, that was one of the findings that we've when we saw this dip in creativity among 10 and 15-year-olds, we first thought, no, this is just, developmental psychology that plays into this. But then, we got exactly the same responses from parents and very consistent responses from teachers. In fact, teachers were sometimes better observant or more consistent with the students' responses than the parents. But I do think that is another important insight, that you ask different people and you get actually quite consistent answers, which should again reinforce the validity of those measures. No?
Thank you. I'd like to thank both of you for joining us and sharing what you've learned about social and emotional skills in these contexts. And we're going to turn it over now to start meeting our panelists. So Ruth and Andreas, again, thank you for your time and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
There are 3 panelists that are joining us this morning in Houston, afternoon, and other places. The first that I'll introduce is Dr. Roberta Scott. She's the Director of Social and Emotional Learning at the Houston Independent School District, which also includes the Department of Student Discipline, which is very relevant to some of the things that we're talking about right now. She has been an educator and administrator for 18 years, is committed to equity, particularly wanting to address issues of disproportionality in the school to prison pipeline. When I first met Dr. Scott a few years ago, her team had around 5 staff, and now there are over 50 that are working with Dr. Scott to provide the support to students across the district, though I'm guessing she would tell you that's 50 fewer than she probably needs. Dr. Scott partnered with a research manager at HISD over the summer to provide professional development to principals around the study so that they could understand it and think about how it might influence the practices and the things that they're doing on their own campuses. In my opinion, today's event would not be possible if 1, Dr. Scott wasn't so willing to work in partnership with HERC to support this project, and 2, if she wasn't able to join us today. Her voice and local perspective are so important in helping us understand how districts utilize research to drive decision-making and planning with the ultimate goal of supporting students. And she serves on more committees, boards, and organizations than I have time to name right now. Dr. Adrienne Kennedy is also joining us. She's a parent, lifelong learner, and fierce advocate for children and families, and serves as a lead partner at Transform Ed. She brings 20 years of experience working with children, navigating threatening systems and those who support them. After having spent nearly a decade working with youth in foster care, that has led her to the field of education. Since then, Dr. Kennedy has provided coaching, training, consulting, and technical assistance to individuals at many levels within school districts, including teachers, students, principals, superintendent, and also thinking about district and state leaders. The focus of her work has been on guiding organizations towards practices that create, support, and sustain optimal school environments where all students can thrive. She's passionate about helping educators learn to identify and counter the beliefs, behaviors, and ways of being able to perpetuate negative outcomes and experiences for children and families, especially those who have been historically marginalized. Dr. Kennedy brings an important perspective in helping us understand the national context around social and emotional skills and how districts around the country are serving students and the broader conversations happening nationally around social and emotional learning. So thank you, Dr. Kennedy. And finally, Dr. Fred Oswald. Dr. Oswald is a professor of sociology and the Herbert S. Autry Chair in Social Sciences at Rice University. A prolific researcher and writer, he brings a wealth of knowledge in understanding how skills are measured and how they're connected to a host of later outcomes, especially around the workforce. This is why I thought Dr. Oswald's voice and experience would be so helpful in today's conversation to really think beyond even some of the outcomes that we presented today, to think about what we know about some of the longer term implications of social and emotional skills are for students as they become adults. Dr. Oswald serves on HERC's advisory board around this social and emotional skill study, and that's just one of many examples of his commitment to the field, with a list of advisory and editorial boards he serves on so long that I'm not sure that he sleeps. And so I'd like to thank also Dr. Oswald for joining us. And so now I'd like to take a minute or two to invite the presenters or the panelists to add anything about themselves or their organizations or their work that might help us understand some of the things that we just heard from Ruth and Andreas. And Roberta, you're unmuted, so you get to go first.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. I am the director for the Social and Emotional Learning and Student Discipline Department here in Houston Independent School District. I oversee the services and supports for social and emotional learning, crisis intervention and response, behavior, mental health, and student discipline needs for all of our students. We offer resources and services to help our students develop the skills to manage their emotions, form positive relationships, feel empathy for others, and to make really responsible decisions. Our department impact improving students' performances through the non-academic barriers. And so I'm excited to be here today in this effort so that we can better support our students' social and emotional needs and be able to improve their academic outcomes.
Thank you. I can add as well. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Dr. Adrienne Kennedy. I'm a lead partner at Transforming Education, and I'm here today on behalf of the National Center to Improve Social and Emotional Learning and School Safety. And the center really provides technical assistance to support states and districts in the implementation of SEL, evidence-based programs and practices. And our charge from the U.S. Department of Education is to build the knowledge and capacity of the state educational agencies to support their local educational agencies to support their schools. And our vision is that when all children are educated in places of equity, safety, learning, as well as receive the integrated academic, social, and emotional supports that meet their needs, then they can achieve their greatest potential in K through 16 education in their career and in their life. I'll just add also that I'm a lifelong learner. I love to connect with others, so I'm so happy to be here to share what I've learned and to learn from others as well. My core value is justice, and so everything I do is for the purpose of moving the most vulnerable and marginalized children and families in our society to higher ground.
Excellent. Well, I can't help but agree in thanking you for allowing me to join you and share knowledge, I guess, that complements the experts on the webinar and those who presented. My training is in organizational psychology. We take we're focused on measurement. We take a data-driven approach to understanding how people manage the pathways from education to careers. That takes on the context. It's not just measurement of the person, it's the understanding of the context. And so, you can be so data-driven, sometimes you get lost in statistics and forget about where it's being implemented. So my 20+ years of work has been involved in understanding employment and educational environments and everything in between as people make those pathways. As Adrienne said, with a sensitivity to opportunity and access. That's the whole point of being data-driven, is understanding where to, through intervention, you learn where to intervene most effectively and how to develop effectively, knowing where people are at so that you can guide where they're going. I think everyone can resonate with how we want good data and not just big data in this world where we talk about big data. We need to have the types of measures that reflect the constructs we're interested in, such as those Ruth had mentioned with persistence and interpersonal skills, and where the measures don't just have those labels, that they actually have good data behind it. So again, I look forward to conversing with the panel and discussing what we know and moving forward.
Thank you all. Because I'm moderating, I'm going to go ahead and ask the first question that is of interest to me. And I think it will be of interest actually to a lot of folks. And so Roberta, this first question is to you. And I was hoping that you might be able to help people who are listening understand why a study like this was important for HISD to participate in, and what are some of the steps you've taken as a district as a result of some of the early findings from a study like this?
Well, this effort aligns with one of our district strategic priorities to ensure student health, safety, and well-being by continuing to service more students' mental health and social and emotional learning needs. And so we're looking at elevating our programming around what we're currently doing to be more targeted and have those opportunities to meet the needs on our individual campuses based on the data that we received. And so we can target those areas and strengths where we see if there are weaknesses that we have identified. We are able to put in programming as it relates to that is targeted specifically for those particular areas as identified by the study. The other component is monitoring change over time. So this will give us a benchmark or baseline to address the social and emotional learning needs of all of our students. So we have somewhere where we can start and then start to build upon and monitor the change. We're looking to have student level strength and needs being able to identify, are our students moving? We've done that for years for academics, but we have not had anything as it relates to our social and emotional learning needs. So I'm very excited about this effort because it will give us something that we've been asking for quite some time. This is also going to be, help us to access strategies designated to improve school climate and SEL skills. Explore additional student needs, and then be able to actually be more strategic around differentiating. So we always throw that around for academics, but now we'll be able to say we can assign and track our interventions based on the social and emotional learning needs of our students in Houston Independent School District. So I'm very excited about that.
Thanks, Roberta. And actually that leads me to a question for Adrian. If you could tell us a little bit about, Roberta gave us great context in thinking about how Houston is thinking about social and emotional skills, social emotional learning, the needs of students. What are some of the things you're hearing from other school districts around the country around whether they're starting to think and how they're starting to think about students' needs in these areas?
Sure. Well, I can tell you that when the National Center was first awarded, they did an in-depth need sensing process to really help us to understand the most urgent and important needs related to SEL and school safety, and those whole person initiatives like adult wellness, trauma-informed practices, restorative practices, all of those types of things. And we heard 5 things. First, loud and clear, there was a very strong interest in understanding SEL and its connection to equity, because practitioners were telling us that they really understood that when it's done well, they're addressing the well-being of the entire community and every individual in that community. And also when it's done poorly, it can exacerbate disparities, including the racial and other disparities that we see. And so as a result, the National Center has a domain of work that we think about as being equity-centered. And we also have at the center of equity, we center equity in everything that we do, every single thing that we do. So the question is always, when we talk about SEL, who's being served well and who's not being served well. And we also heard a lot about SEL integration. People want strategies with systems in place to make the strategies successful. And practitioners were saying to us, what is SEL? Is it a program or is it a way of being? And our perspective at the center is that SEL is not a program. It is a way of being. And the dialogue that we are having with practitioners is around how to build community and how you really show up to support children. And actually, we have a compendium of resources that Dr. Angela Ward recently co-authored. It's a compendium of resources for district leaders on integrating social and emotional learning throughout the school system. And I'd be happy to share a link to that compendium in the chat. And really with that, practitioners don't actually have to go and find a program. They can use this resource as a guide to thinking about how to integrate these practices into their current teaching practice and their school climate. And also the center has a sizable body of work around alignment and coherence, which is making sure that SEL and whole person initiatives are all working together toward a coherent vision of well-being for the community. We also heard from practitioners around the country about a need for sustainable implementation of evidence-based programs and practices. The question is, how does the work last beyond just me, beyond staff turnover and funding and so on? And effective and sustainable implementation is really at the center. The idea of sustainable implementation is also very much rooted in equity as well, because sustainability is about making sure that the practices come from the community, that they're identified by, created by, and overseen by the community. We also heard a lot about data-driven cycles of improvement. We measure what we treasure. So how do I know what can I see that is demonstrating that what I'm doing is working? Educators are really increasingly interested in understanding how measuring SEL and school climate and school safety can be used in a formative way to improve the way students are served. And then finally, we heard from educators about really about the spread of anxiety around critical race theory. And that's really about helping practitioners at all levels of the system to understand the definitions and the distinctions and find their strength in being able to lean into these conversations and help families understand what SEL is and isn't, and what CRT is and isn't. And of course, there's been some pushback. There was recently some articles published about SEL being a Trojan horse for critical race theory, or that it replaces parenting. And so our role is really to help people to understand that SEL is really about all of the adults working together to support the young people that they work with.
Thanks, Dr. Kennedy. One of the questions that came into the chat, I think, reflects some of the things that you and Dr. Scott were talking about. The question is, districts have limited resources. How can people think about what's one strategy to build SEL skills if you had one? And I think maybe from the things that you're both saying, it's hard to pick one strategy, and maybe you can't pick one strategy. It needs to be more holistic. There need to be more things that are considered than just like one approach and one way to provide resources to students and families. Some of the topics that you're mentioning, and these are questions that are coming up in the chat, and some of the questions that I had that I thought Fred might be able to help us answer is thinking about how measuring these skills, to Dr. Kennedy's point, how measuring these skills helps us understand the later outcomes for students, how we use skills to understand how students can be successful in the future when we're thinking about joining the workforce. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about measurement and later outcomes for students when we're thinking about social and emotional skills.
Sure. As I mentioned in my own introduction, I am focused on measurement because we do want good data, not just big data. And that requires some work, making sure that the measures that we're interested in, whether it's interpersonal skills like showing empathy or teamwork, or intrapersonal skills like time management or persistence, making sure the content of measures reflect what we think should be measured, right, with respect to those ideas or those constructs. That involves, you know, folks who have developed measures for a long period of time, like myself, and kind of balancing the statistical value with the practical notion of you got to give something short, right? People don't have enough time to fill out measures. And by the way, as you said, Aaron, what are they going to do with those data when it operates in context, and making sure that the data that come out of it is not only good, but is used and is informative. So the devil's in those details. So I'm not going to give a definitive answer for how to do that, because it really depends on your setting. But I will say that lots of, you know, there are lots of general issues that matter that Roberta and Adrian already mentioned, sorry, I keep saying measurement. As Roberta said, I mean, my eyes lit up when she was talking about how to focus on investments, right? That we have limited time and funds, and we need to figure out where to invest, and our data can help guide us toward those investments or changes in those investments over time. And also she mentioned how we should change and track our progress, not only for accountability's sake, but to understand the nature of our students. And this ties into Adrian's point about understanding diversity in terms of SEL. I've told my students that there's something of a happy coincidence that by measuring students diversely, by including SEL and not just academic outcomes, you're understanding diversity. You're understanding the wide range of what people are, and you're also informing, as we all know in the room here, those listening, that SEL contributes to a process that gets us to the outcomes we want. So we think about GPA, and it's like through this keyhole, GPA, graduation, those are important outcomes, but SEL gets us to that process point of how you get to that. And if you don't pay attention to that, then you're not paying attention to the support that's needed by diverse populations to get to those outcomes. And so it speaks to the interventions point. If you don't have good measurement, I would say a lot is lost, right? You're losing, you can have the best intervention, and if you don't have good measurement, you're not going to know about it. So I think that's really important. I also think Adrian's point about how we're not siloed, right? A test seems like a silo. You're sitting there and getting a grade, and it's your evaluation. But really, we're all in this together in education and in the workforce, right? Employers want teamwork. They don't want a silo. And so we need to think that way in educational environments as well. And we need to think about that in terms of measurement. So this isn't my particular area of measurement, but there are folks who are focused on collaborative assessments, right? Teamwork and collaborative assessments. And although I do look at that through methodology, that is where you're noting that students are we use the term nested, but their data are within the same environment, within a classroom or you know, different classrooms as they move around throughout the day. And you have to take that into account and relate that to the qualities of the teachers and so on. There are also folks who are interested in team collaborative assignments. So it's more like a training intervention where the team collaboration, of course, there are team goals in terms of performance, but more to the point of this webinar, there's an SEL component. So how are people interacting as you contribute to a team? You might be the component that is the glue that keeps everyone else going and reaching toward an outcome. And so if you don't measure SEL, you're not going to notice that that person was so essential to a team in this educational environment I'm describing, but you can consider the implications for the workplace as well. We all have people serving different roles in the workplace. And as we advance with technology and AI and so on, as was mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, in a sense, it emphasizes our humanity, that SEL just becomes even more important. And And you know what I'm going to say, we need to measure it. So thanks.
One of the questions that I had, in particular for Dr. Scott and Dr. Kennedy, in seeing some of the findings in particular that Ruth presented, and we're seeing a lot of questions come up in the chat about this, do the patterns that we're seeing make sense? And particularly when we're thinking about student discipline. You know, the study around student discipline that HERC did focused on Black and Hispanic students because those were the students who were more likely to be experienced disciplinary actions. And what we were seeing is that more assertive students were more likely to be experiencing disciplinary actions. And so can you tell us a little bit about, you know, are those the types of patterns that you see in schools, and what might that say about how to provide resources to students and teachers and schools in identifying the needs of students?
Yes, let me start off with that. So we have said here in HISD, and I continue to say, implementing SEL into academics leads to reduction in misbehaviors and emotional dysregulation, which creates more time for teaching, for teachers to teach and students to learn. And so the data aligns with what we've been saying for years. We cannot get to the academics until we implement the social and emotional learning. And then those students that are really struggling with behaviors, when I looked at the data and we looked at the assertiveness, and we saw that those were some of the negative skills that students displayed, those were the students that exhibited the higher number of discipline. And so we have to find a way to channel that negative energy so that those students can utilize those skills to work for them. And so we're already on it. We have 2 curriculums that we utilize here in HISD. And so we have targeted those, the curriculum topics that aligns with persistence, that aligns with assertiveness, resiliency, and all of those. And so we're being strategic. We're working with our campuses so that those students that are having issues with discipline, that they have those skills, because I also believe in that we have to teach those skills. Students have to, first they have to be taught, they have to be practiced, and they have to be reinforced. And so we're providing professional development for our teachers so that they have those skills to be able to teach them, and then allow students to practice and then be able to reinforce. So once again, I am excited about, you know, this data as we continue to move forward with the social emotional learning initiatives that we have here in the district.
Yes, and I would just add to what you said, Dr. Scott, about starting with the teachers. I think that is a really important point to make here, that the social emotional development, skill development in students starts with the adults. And so we really have to have the adults first examine what are their own mindsets and identities that they bring to the classroom, and really cultivate a lens where they can examine their own behaviors and interactions with students. It really takes a lens of criticality to be able to examine like what's happening within the context, the social political context, the school context, what's happening within the school that is also acting upon the students, and not just putting the entire onus on the students to develop skills. But we have to do some work ourselves as adults, and we have to also look at where are some changes that need to happen within the system that can help create this optimal learning environment for students.
Yes, and I also want to add, I'm happy to say that HISD, they have recognized that we do need to address the adults. We have launched an adult SEL initiative where we have targeted professional development just for our teachers around the social and emotional learning skills, such as self-management, self-awareness, relationship building. We've targeted trauma-informed practices, restorative discipline practices, culturally responsive teaching, behavior interventions, you name it. We're on the right track. But I think this data will definitely give us another lens and to be more strategic, to align with what we've always said. But now we have the numbers to show, hey, this is our data, and we own this data. So you know, the numbers, they don't lie. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to expand and enhance the current work that we're doing here.
Well, I could continue this conversation probably for another hour, but we know our attendees have joined us for this first hour. And so I think I'd like to wrap up by asking the panelists if there's one thing that folks take away from the panel today, from the presentations today, just from the things that you've learned in your own work around social and emotional skills and social emotional learning, what that might be. And so Fred, I'm going to kick it to you first.
Oh, wow. Well, I guess I would say let the data inform you on the interventions that matter, because many people have made practical attempts and you can see where things have worked and where they haven't. But I'm gonna balance that by saying don't let that limit your imagination for what is possible. We're all working on this vigorously, as you can see, and creating new types of measurement and interventions. And so definitely work with people like folks you see here, but folks in your environment who care about this topic greatly, and let your imagination be informed by the data, I guess is the way to put those two things together. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Dr. Kennedy?
Sure. I would say that SEL starts with you. It's not a program or something that you do to students. It's about how you show up. It's about the social emotional skills you possess and how you model them for students and the learning environment that you create. In order to get to those long-term benefits for students that we so want, we as adults first have to examine the ways in which our identities and mindsets and emotions and actions encourage or inhibit an equitable and inclusive learning environment where all students can thrive. Once we've done that, then we have to do the work of cultivating a learning environment in which our community members, including students, families, and teachers, are valued, can enact their agency, and build meaningful relationships and experience a strong sense of identity, safety, and belonging. These practices are really at the core of any effective SEL practice. And it's also imperative that educators take a strengths-based approach to educating and engaging with students, with parents, and with the community.
Thank you. And Dr. Scott, if you could close us out.
I most certainly will. So SEL, think of this, if you will. SEL is the plate. It is not something extra. You have to have those foundation skills in order to be successful. Students can achieve their absolute best socially, emotionally, and academically with those social emotional learning skills. By better supporting our students' needs, we are better able to help them improve their academic outcomes.
Well, thank you all. And I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank our presenters, and I'd like to thank all the participants who joined us today, asked great questions. And, we appreciate you listening and taking this back with you, and looking forward to seeing you all again in the spring to talk more about these issues. This is not a one-time conversation. This is an ongoing conversation that we need to be having. And so again, from HERC and the folks at Kinder, we'd like to say thank you and have a great day.